This is the Champion of Democracy Element 2 Part 2, which starts with anti-German propaganda and war hysteria as we talk about World War I on the home front. Now, where we want to start here is the Committee on Public Information, which was created and headed by this guy, George Creel. Now, Creel was young, outspoken, and tactless, but he had great enthusiasm and imagination. He sold America on the war, and he sold the world on Woodrow Wilson. Essentially, he was the American Minister of Propaganda, if you will pardon the term. He employed 150,000 workers, half of whom were the 4-Minute Men. Now, the 4-Minute Men took to the streets giving patriotic speeches. Creel used a series of posters, leaflets, pamphlets, movies, songs, all sorts of different things as propaganda to get people fired up and behind the war effort in America. Some of the more famous efforts of the Committee on Public Information were movies, such as The Beast of Berlin, which you see the movie poster for that on the slide here, and To Hell with the Kaiser, which you can see being advertised right here. Songs were also very popular, most notably Over There by George Cohan. I'm sure you've heard it before. It goes, over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. That's it. That's all you're going to get from me. The bottom line is that Creel's posters, leaflets, pamphlets, movies, songs, all sorts of propaganda, along with the speeches of the 4-Minute Men, those were usually way longer than 4 minutes, by the way, rallied the nation into a patriotic frenzy. But there were also some negative effects of Creel's propaganda. He may have oversold the message a little bit, making Wilson larger than life and leading the world to expect too much of him. And German Americans, who were 8% of the U.S. population, became the targets of anti-German war hysteria. Now, if you take a look at this poster here in front of you, this is from Britain, actually, and you could pause it for a second here and look at all the different facets of it. But the bottom line is that in Britain, Germans who were living there were highly discriminated against, often leading to beatings, being told don't let them work here, etc. Well, that idea eventually carried its way into the United States with the propaganda we had going here. Now, the German Americans really hadn't done anything to deserve any of the punishments they got, other than just be German. But many were beaten, tarred and feathered, and one was lynched in Chicago. Germans were being depicted as brutes, as you notice here, wearing the Kaiser's mustache as well. And German books were being removed from libraries. German classes were being canceled in schools. German music like Wagner and Beethoven was considered unsafe to play. A term that became very common when describing the German was now a Hun, or a barbarian. And various German things that we enjoyed in the United States were being given new names to make them more Americanized and less German. Sauerkraut was now being called Liberty Cabbage. Hamburger, which was invented as a sandwich in the town of Hamburg, Germany, when sailors would show up and basically get the ground steak in between 2 pieces of bread as a sandwich. Hamburger was now being called Liberty Steak. Breweries with German names like Pabst and Schlitz were having trouble selling beer. And all this war hysteria led to some unfortunate political decisions, such as the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which basically were designed to suppress any pro-German or anti-British or anti-war opinions. Criticism of the Wilson administration and its war policy became grounds for arrest and imprisonment. Basically, what it amounted to is that the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act censored and punished 1,900 people who were accused of spying or just even criticizing the government. Many were socialists who were members of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. Eugene Debs, the leader of the Wobblies, was convicted to 10 years in prison in 1918, as were approximately 100 other socialists. Many felt that the two laws violated First Amendment rights to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition and question your government. But the U.S. Supreme Court case Schenck v. United States in 1919 supported the two acts, arguing that freedom of speech can be revoked when it creates a clear and present danger. So the path was cleared for a full-on mobilization of the war, and really no opposition to it in any way. Now, the U.S. declared war in 1917, but it wasn't really ready for it. Remember that Wilson was a pacifist, meaning he liked peace and non-aggression. And therefore, over the course of his presidency, he had let the military slip to 15th in the world, behind Denmark. Now, that was going to have to change. After 3 years, all sides were down to the last men, and the United States needed to make a difference, and quickly. Now, of course, that led to one of the most famous posters in American history, brought about in 1916, the famous "I Want You for the U.S. Army" poster. Uncle Sam wants you, I should say, if you take a look at the slide here. Now, Woodrow Wilson didn't really like the draft, but he had to do it, as he had to do many things during his presidency that he really didn't initially like or want to do. There wasn't much support for the draft from Congress, which predicted massive resistance from citizens. But nonetheless, Wilson proceeded ahead, and the Draft Act of 1917 required registration of all males between 18 and 45, and no draft dodger could hire a sub. Remember the Civil War, when people would get drafted and just basically pay someone to go in their place instead? Well, you couldn't do that under the Draft Act of 1917. As a result, the Army grew to 4 million within a few months, was all. Although 337,000 people did dodge the draft. Women were also allowed to serve for the first time, and African Americans also served, but they weren't allowed to be in any combat. They were mostly cooks and people who did construction work. But nonetheless, the military, at least in terms of numbers, was ready to go, and in the Great War of Europe, that may have been enough. But obviously there was still a long way to go on the home front to prepare for the war and contribute to it. In March of 1918, Wilson created the War Industries Board, which allowed the government to take control of economic planning and production during the war. Now, America had always been a laissez-faire, hands-off economy, so not everybody was thrilled about that. Meanwhile, long before he would ever become President of the United States and get blamed for the stock market crash in 1929, Herbert Hoover was just a part of the Wilson administration during World War I, heading the Food Administration. Now, Hoover had successfully fed Belgium in 1914 when the Germans were marching through, and now he was tasked with feeding America and its allies. Hoover asked only for voluntary compliance rather than mandatory food rationing, and like Creel, used a lot of propaganda. Hoover asked, once again not mandated, he asked for meatless Tuesdays and wheatless Wednesdays. He told people to be patriotic to the core when eating apples. Victory gardens became popular, as people were also encouraged to save vegetables for the war effort. And the Prohibition effort had also helped to preserve corn and sugar and other things necessary for making illegal whiskey. When those things were prohibited, there was plenty of corn and sugar to go around. Plus, many U.S. brewers were German, which was also a good enough reason to not drink alcohol. The U.S. Food Administration and the war inadvertently helped with the passage of the 18th Amendment prohibiting alcohol. In the end, Hoover's approach worked fantastically. Farm production went up 25%, and food exports tripled. It worked so well that other administrations tried to do similar things to the Food Administration. The Fuel Administration followed suit with heatless Mondays and gasless Sundays. All in all, the efforts of Hoover and the various administrations raised $21 billion, 70% of what was needed to pay for the war. The rest was just raised in taxes. However, some of the efforts were forced. People were sometimes bullied or guilted into participation, but by peers, not the government. Although this particular propaganda poster would suggest otherwise. As people were convinced to get involved, mobilization efforts also expanded the federal government's size and power, even taking over the railroads and creating daylight savings time to extend the workday and save fuel. These were all things that people were willing to accept during the war, but it seemed to be a slap in the face to the laissez-faire, hands-off economic nation that we'd always known. The government was distinctly taking over the economy. As for organized labor during the war, well, the Wilson administration had the National War Labor Board, which headed off any labor disputes that could take place and might disrupt the war effort. They basically promised that any unemployed male would be drafted, so they suggested you stay on the job. However, they did press management into higher wages and an 8-hour workday. They would not allow any unions, though. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, supported the war effort, but the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, didn't, and if you remember, they were punished for it. Now, the efforts of the National War Labor Board didn't always work. There were still 6,000 strikes that broke out while the U.S. was in World War I. That was followed after the war in 1919 by the U.S. Steel Strike, which is the biggest in U.S. history, as 250,000 workers just walked off the job. But for the most part, labor efforts were on task and getting things done for the war effort itself. But within the war effort, there were two revolutionary social things going on as well: the Great Migration and the 19th Amendment. African Americans and women flooded into the factories, as many of the regular workers were now fighting in the war. And many African Americans moved north in the beginnings of the war to make that happen. This was called the Great Migration, and people moving up from the south to the north were rapidly employed in what used to be mostly white factories. This Great Migration would start again at the beginning of World War I in 1914, and realistically went right all the way to the end of World War II in 1945. But despite its significance, the Great Migration wasn't always accepted very well. It often led to race riots. In East St. Louis in 1917, there was a riot that killed 40 African Americans and 9 whites. And in 1919, there was a race riot in Chicago that killed 23 African Americans and 15 whites, all being born out of increasing racial tensions within the city. As for the women's movement, well, they were divided about the war effort. Many were pacifists. They just wanted peace and didn't want to be involved in the war at all. But others felt that being involved in the war would help boost their efforts for equality, so most of the women's movement supported the war. Wilson himself had been impressed by the efforts of women during the war and endorsed suffrage. New York, Michigan, Oklahoma, and San Diego also allowed it, and Britain, Austria-Hungary, and Germany passed it in 1919. Then, 70 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was passed in 1920. Although if you look at this chart here, you'll notice that the women's right to vote, women's suffrage, was granted in many states well before that time. Remember, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that anything not written in the Constitution is up to states to decide for themselves, and prior to 1920, nothing was in the Constitution about the women's right to vote. So, various states as early as 1869 in Wyoming and various other western states where women were seen as being stronger and far more independent, well, they passed women's right to vote long before 1920, while there were some other states in the East, as you can see here, that had never passed women's suffrage until the 19th Amendment came out. So it was different in various places around the country, but by 1920 there was no denying it anymore for anyone. Women have the right to vote. Okay, that's it for Element 2, Part 2. Thank you for listening.